Before anything else, before meaning, before explanation, before understanding. Let's return to a moment. Not a loud moment, not a dramatic one, not something anyone clapped for, a quiet moment. A moment where something inside you paused, even though everything around you was pulling you to react. You remember it. It didn't feel spiritual at the time. It didn't feel heroic. It just felt heavy. You were hurt, not confused, not sensitive, actually hurt. Someone crossed a line. A situation unfolded unfairly. Something you didn't deserve landed on your shoulders, and for once, you had every reason to respond. You could have spoken, you could have defended yourself, you could have withdrawn completely and no one would have blamed you. Your pain had logic on its side. But instead, you stopped. Not because you were afraid, not because you were weak, not because you didn't know what to say. You stopped because something deeper than reaction was holding you steady. That pause, that small space between what happened and how you responded. That is where everything began to change. Most people don't realize how powerful that space is. Life is constantly testing one thing in us, not our strength, not our intelligence, not even our faith. It tests our response. Pain arrives unannounced. Pressure builds without permission. And in those moments, the world expects a predictable reaction. Hurt for hurt, cold for cold, anger for anger. That's the pattern. That's how cycles continue. But you interrupted the pattern. An interruption is never comfortable. It feels unnatural at first, like standing still while everything inside you wants to move. You might have felt it in your chest. That tightness, that urge to say something sharp, that temptation to protect yourself by hardening. But instead, you stayed present. You didn't abandon yourself, and you didn't abandon your values either. That matters more than you know, because identity isn't revealed when life is easy. Identity is revealed in the moment you are justified to become someone else and choose not to. That moment didn't erase your pain. It didn't fix the situation. It didn't make everything suddenly okay, but it did something quieter. It anchored you. From that moment on, something inside you shifted. Not dramatically, not overnight, but permanently. You may not have had words for it at the time. You may have even questioned yourself afterward. Did I do the right thing? Should I have said more? Did I let myself down? But deep down, beneath the noise of doubt, there was a calm, a subtle knowing that you didn't lose yourself in that moment. And that is rare. Because many people survive pain by becoming someone they don't recognize anymore. They survive by hardening, by closing off, by building walls so thick they can't feel anything at all. You didn't do that. You stayed open without becoming fragile. You stayed kind without becoming naive. You stayed grounded without becoming passive. That choice wasn't loud enough for the world to notice, but it was strong enough to change the direction of your inner life. And when that happens, everything else eventually follows. If you've been feeling different lately, quieter, less reactive, less pulled into drama, it didn't come from nowhere. It began there. In that quiet moment when you chose who you would be instead of who your pain demanded you become. Stay here, because in the next part, we'll talk about why that choice was so difficult, and why the difficulty itself is proof that something real was happening inside you. What you chose wasn't difficult because you lacked strength. It was difficult because your pain was legitimate. That matters. You weren't overreacting. You weren't imagining things. You weren't being too sensitive. Something real happened, and your nervous system knew it. When pain arrives, the body responds before the mind can explain. Heart rate changes. Breath tightens. Thoughts race ahead trying to restore control. This is not weakness. It's survival. The human brain is designed to protect first and understand later. So when someone hurts you, your system immediately looks for safety. Sometimes safety looks like anger. Sometimes it looks like distance. Sometimes it looks like shutting down completely. These responses aren't evil. They are ancient. They kept our ancestors alive. But survival responses don't always protect the soul. That's why your choice was heavy. Because you weren't just choosing how to respond externally. You were choosing whether to let pain decide who you become internally. And pain is persuasive. Pain speaks with urgency. It says, protect yourself now. Say something before it's too late. Do something so you don't feel powerless. Pain makes reaction feel necessary. Grace, on the other hand, feels slow. Grace doesn't shout. It doesn't rush you. It doesn't promise immediate relief. Grace simply asks one question. Who do you want to be after this moment passes? That question is uncomfortable when you're already wounded, because answering it means accepting that you may not feel better right away. It means allowing discomfort without numbing it. It means trusting that staying aligned is more important than being understood. And alignment is costly. You felt that cost. You felt the internal pull between what was justified and what felt right, between what would have released tension quickly and what would preserve your integrity long term. That tension is where growth happens, not in moments of clarity, but in moments of conflict inside the self. Many people never feel that tension because they act before it appears. They react so quickly they never have to confront what their response says about them. You didn't. You stayed with the discomfort long enough to make a conscious choice. That's why it felt exhausting. That's why it lingered with you afterward. Not because you did something wrong, but because you did something intentional. Intentional choices require presence. Presence requires energy, and you were already tired. Still, you chose not to abandon your inner compass. You chose not to outsource your identity to someone else's behavior. That is not common. Most people let circumstances define the version of themselves they show to the world. You resisted that, and resistance always costs something up front, before it gives anything back. But what it gives back is something reaction never can. Stability. Not emotional numbness. Not detachment. But a grounded sense of self that doesn't collapse when pressure rises. That's why, after that moment, even though nothing outside changed immediately, something inside you did. You didn't feel victorious. You didn't feel proud. You felt quieter, less pulled, less scattered. Less desperate to explain yourself. That quiet wasn't emptiness, it was strength settling. And in the next part, we'll explore what that choice revealed about you, not as a label, but as a truth that was already forming long before that moment arrived. That moment didn't create something new in you. It revealed what was already there. Most people misunderstand this part. They think strength appears only after a great decision. But real strength is usually present long before, quietly forming, waiting for pressure to make it visible. What your choice revealed was not perfection. It revealed anchoring. An identity that isn't built on how others treat you. An inner authority that doesn't require permission from circumstances to exist. You didn't choose grace because it was easy. You chose it because something in you refused to betray itself. That refusal says more about you than any external success ever could. It means your sense of self is not dependent on winning, not dependent on being right, not dependent on being validated. You didn't need to prove your worth by overpowering someone else. You already knew it, even if you couldn't explain it in words. This is where many people lose themselves. They confuse reaction with strength. They confuse dominance with power. They confuse control with safety. So when they're hurt, they abandon their values to protect their ego. You didn't. And that tells us something precise. It tells us you are internally governed. Not rigid, not passive, but rooted. Rooted people don't need to perform when pressure rises. They don't need to harden to feel secure. They don't need to become louder to feel seen. They remain consistent because consistency is who they are, not something they turn on when it's convenient. That kind of person is rare, not because they are better, but because they have learned how to stay with themselves when it would be easier to leave. Leaving yourself is the fastest way to reduce pain, but it comes at a cost. You avoided that cost. You stayed. And staying requires courage that doesn't announce itself. You may not have thought, "I'm being brave." You probably thought, "I'm just tired of losing myself." And that is often how real transformation begins. Not with ambition, but with refusal. A refusal to keep repeating the same internal collapse. A refusal to let pain rewrite your values. A refusal to become smaller just to survive. That refusal is not rebellion. It's self-respect. And self-respect doesn't shout. It stabilizes. That's why, since then, you may have noticed something subtle. You don't explain yourself as much. You don't chase resolution the same way. You don't feel the same urgency to be understood, not because you don't care, but because you're no longer negotiating your identity in moments of stress. You already decided who you are, and once that decision is made internally, life stops pulling you apart externally the way it used to. In the next part, we'll talk about the invisible shift that follows a choice like this. Why peace begins to appear without effort. Why certain things quietly fall away. And why you may feel like you crossed a threshold you can't quite name, but know you can't go back from. The shift didn't announce itself. There was no dramatic sign, no sudden relief, no moment where everything made sense all at once. It happened quietly, almost unnoticed. You didn't wake up feeling new. You just noticed. Certain things didn't pull you the same way anymore. The noise softened. Not outside, but inside. Situations that once stirred anxiety now felt distant. Conversations that once drained you no longer held the same weight. You still cared, but you didn't cling. You still felt, but you didn't spiral. This is how real change usually arrives, not as excitement, but as stability. It's easy to mistake this phase for numbness, but numbness feels empty. What you felt was grounded, present. You didn't lose emotion. You gained space around it, space to breathe, space to respond, space to remain yourself without being overwhelmed. That space is everything, because when you stop reacting automatically, life stops controlling you. You may have noticed certain people slowly drifting away, not through conflict, not through confrontation, just distance, less contact, less friction, less involvement. This wasn't rejection. It was alignment correcting itself. When you stop operating from urgency, relationships built on urgency can't survive. When you stop feeding chaos, chaos looks for another place to live. You didn't push anyone out. You simply stopped bending yourself to keep them comfortable. And that changed the dynamic. You may also have noticed a strange clarity emerging. Decisions that once felt foggy now feel obvious. Not easy, but clear. You're no longer asking, "What should I do to keep the peace?" You're asking, "What aligns with who I am now?" That question changes everything. Because clarity doesn't come from having all the answers. It comes from knowing what you will no longer compromise. This is the invisible shift. When your inner boundaries solidify, life reorganizes around them. Not aggressively, not forcefully, naturally. You didn't manifest this. You didn't force it. You simply became less available for what no longer fit. And what doesn't fit eventually removes itself. That's why this season feels different. Not lighter, but steadier. You're still carrying responsibility, still facing uncertainty, but you're not leaking energy the way you used to. You're not explaining yourself endlessly. You're not chasing closure at any cost. You're allowing things to be incomplete without feeling broken. That's not detachment. That's maturity. And maturity always feels quieter than chaos. In the next part, we'll talk about why life begins to respond differently once this shift occurs. Why progress feels less forced. Why resistance loses its grip. And why moving forward now requires less effort than before. At some point after that shift, you may have noticed something surprising. Life didn't suddenly become easy, but it stopped pushing back the same way. Things that once felt blocked began to move. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily. You weren't forcing outcomes anymore. You weren't chasing answers. You weren't trying to control every detail. And strangely, that's when progress started happening. This is where many people get confused. They think life rewards effort alone, that pushing harder is what creates movement. But effort without alignment creates resistance, and alignment creates flow. When you stopped reacting from pain, you stopped feeding the very patterns that were keeping you stuck. Think about it. Every time you reacted defensively in the past, you reinforced a cycle. Same emotions, same conversations, same outcomes. Reaction kept you familiar, but trapped. Your new response broke that loop. And when a loop breaks, energy is released. That energy doesn't disappear. It redirects. This is why things feel different now. Not because the world changed, but because you did. You're no longer negotiating your worth through conflict. You're no longer waiting for others to validate your boundaries. You're acting from a place of inner permission, and life responds to inner permission faster than it responds to effort. That's why resistance feels lighter, not gone, but less personal. Problems still arise. Challenges still appear, but they don't hook into you the same way. They don't spiral you. They don't define you. They don't drain you. You meet them as yourself, not as a wound trying to survive. That changes the entire dynamic. This is also why opportunities begin to appear more naturally. Not because you're chasing them, but because you're finally ready to receive without needing them to fix you. You're no longer moving from lack. You're moving from stability. And stability attracts situations that require steadiness, not chaos. This is why you may feel less desperate for outcomes. You still care, but you're not clinging. You're allowing things to unfold in their time without collapsing into impatience. That's not resignation. That's trust. Not blind trust, but earned trust. Trust built from watching yourself handle difficulty without losing integrity. Once you know you can survive without becoming someone you're not, fear loses leverage. And when fear loses leverage, life opens up. Not magically, not instantly, but honestly. You're no longer asking life to prove itself to you. You're showing life who you are now. And life always responds to who we are, more than what we want. In the final part, we'll bring everything together, not as a conclusion, but as an invitation. An invitation to walk forward without rushing, without forcing, and without going back to who you no longer are. There is nothing you need to prove now. That's important to hear. You don't need to explain yourself. You don't need to justify your growth. You don't need to convince anyone that what you experienced was real. It was real to you, and that's enough. This season isn't asking you to become louder, stronger, or more impressive. It's asking you to stay aligned, to keep choosing from the place you discovered inside yourself when things were difficult. That place is quiet. but it's solid. You don't need to protect it aggressively. You don't need to defend it constantly. Just don't abandon it. There may be moments ahead when old patterns try to return. Moments where reaction feels tempting again. Moments where bitterness seems easier than patience. Moments where silence feels misunderstood. Those moments don't mean you're failing. They mean you're being invited to choose again. Growth is not a single decision. It's a pattern of remembering who you are when pressure tries to make you forget. And now, you know what it feels like to remain yourself underweight. You know the difference between peace and avoidance, between strength and control, between alignment and performance. That knowledge doesn't disappear. It becomes your compass. So as you move forward, you don't need to rush. You don't need to force outcomes. You don't need to chase clarity. Clarity will meet you where consistency lives. Let your life reflect your values without announcing them. Let your presence speak without explanation. Let your choices remain grounded even when circumstances fluctuate. This is how you continue, not by doing more, but by staying true to what you already discovered. And if at times the path feels lonely, remember this. Loneliness often appears right before alignment deepens. Because not everyone can walk at this pace. Not everyone chooses this level of self-honesty. You didn't choose it to be different. You chose it to be whole. Stay with that. And let everything else adjust in its time. You don't need to go back. You've already crossed that line. Just keep walking forward as yourself.